Father Adelir Antonio de Carli, a social activist, a Catholic priest, and an experienced skydiver, on the 20th of April 2008, attempted a cluster ballooning flight to raise funds for his parishioners, whose personal motto led him to the betterment of his society. This cluster balloon attempt would prove fatal for Father de Carli. Hi everyone, welcome to Ghouleon. Today I'll be covering the famous case of the balloon priest of Brazil. I think this case is a good start for all the content on this channel because it is a fairly simple, straightforward story without any real conspiracy. There is no murder plot, there is nothing like that. I think it's a good story to start off because it's a short, to the point tale of a person's belief in themselves, but which eventually leads to accident. I think there is a lot that can be learned from this story, but in the end, it's essentially fairly similar to an Icarus sort of a tale. And I wanted the first video to be something fairly straightforward and simple because I wanted to make sure that I was making something the way I liked it to be. Hopefully, you also enjoy these kinds of stories and incidents. And yeah, let's get into it. I think we should start with a little introduction about Father de Carli. Father de Carli had a personal motto where he wanted to essentially help everybody that he could around him. And this was something that he did on a regular basis. Even somewhere around 2006, Father de Carli had heard about an incident where the local politicians were having the homeless population of his local town removed by force, where he had learned that the local security forces, which were directly under the jurisdiction of the local politicians, were actually assaulting the homeless people with the butts of their rifles and were pushing them into buses and having them bust out of the city. So that is where Father de Carli decided that he wanted to stand up as a social activist and get those people the rights as well as the recognition that they deserve. It was in these sort of public acts and actions that really garnered a lot of attention and a lot of his original, what would you say, the sort of infamy slash activism that he was a part of was not something to the liking of the local politicians, but something that his local community really appreciated. And it was these sort of acts that eventually led him to be a signatory on one of the letters that went to the UN. And it was these kind of actions that were a staple to whatever Father de Carli was doing throughout his life. Now, the cluster ballooning attempt was intended for the soy farm truckers. Now, these truckers had a very tedious task whenever it came to the season where they had to supply these soy produce directly to the ports. And it is at those ports where they would eventually be put into shipping and then shipped out, because it's a major export for Brazil and those local states or legislatures, whatever are there. There is a major backlog on the system and they are unable to provide immediate relief to these truckers by taking the produce off their hands, and they have to wait multiple days before they are able to essentially take the produce to the ports. Now here, these truckers have to stay by the road without any amenities multiple days, essentially without food, water, rest, anything. So Father de Carli intended to raise money and then also provide a place for them to stay, as well as a place where he wanted them to have all their basic amenities and needs met, and as well as a small chapel there, so that it could be whatever they wanted it to be for the community. Now, it was for this particular agenda that Father de Carli intended to raise money by attempting a cluster ballooning attempt, which would get a lot of attention, as well as it was one of those kind of activities that Father de Carli had attempted once before, and he had seen the effects that it had had on the local community and the way it garnered a lot of interest. Now, if you remember or if you know about these incidents, there have been a few attempts like these in history, and one of them was also, I think, Lawn Chair Larry, where a man ties a bunch of weather balloons and floats off, and it is around the same time and area. So people still had a fascination with these kind of attempts, and it was his hope that if he had made this attempt, he would be easily able to capture the imaginations of people and get as much help as he needed in preparation for his cluster ballooning flight, Father De Carli had made an initial attempt around the 13th of January, where he attempted to go from his hometown of Paranagua to Ampere, Argentina. That is about 110 kilometers or 68 miles. And he peaked up at around 17,000 feet. And it was his attempt to essentially make sure that he would be able to attempt the final cluster ballooning flight. After his first attempt, he had been shown a lot of support from international Catholic groups. He decided to attempt his flight on the 20th of April 2008. Now, this flight would also be a world record flight for the longest attempted cluster ballooning flight. In the preparations, Father De Carli had now tied 1,000 balloons to a buoyancy chair. Now, this buoyancy chair was supposed to travel around 430 odd miles, around 700 plus kilometers, and it was on paper supposed to be a 19-hour long flight from Paranagua to Dorados, I think. If I'm messing up the names, I am sorry. His intention was to cover the 430 odd miles, 700 plus kilometer distance in around 19 hours, as well as being in constant touch with the local authorities and the local stations, which are your radio and news, so that it was a well documented attempt, so that he could gain as much attention for his attempt, as well as gain as much of these funds that he wanted to raise for his community. For his gear, Father De Carli wore thermal overalls, he wore a safety gear, he also carried a radio, a satellite phone, I think a regular cell phone, as well as food for 5 days. He had ration for 5 days because the authorities had guessed that it would take about that much time to scan the local unmanned islands and the local empty beaches to find where he was, and he would need that amount of food to stay alive, as well as to make sure that he had enough to get out of any situation that he found himself to be stuck in. From here on out, I'll be sharing the details of the flight as they presented in real life. So I'll try to stick to it chronologically and share with you all that took place. Starting off on the 20th of April 2008, around 12 pm, Father De Carli addresses the local crowd of all his supporters as well as the news crews who have come to record his flight. He straps himself into his 1,000 balloon chair and hopes that he will clear the rain clouds at around 19,700 feet to make sure that he has his world record, and then later bring himself down to just above 8,000 feet, I guess, and continue further down his flight. Now, he was informed about these rain clouds by the local authorities and specialists, to whom he had very nonchalantly said that I would just rise above these rain clouds and it would be easy to just float above them. Now, it was around this time that he had had a call with the local authorities, whom he had informed that the wind chill was much colder than he had anticipated and that the winds were really strong. He was also complaining about severe difficulty in crossing those rain clouds that they had been warned about. A few hours into his flight, he had had a radio interview with the local news crew called Globo, to whom he had informed that the wind chill was far colder than he had expected. He was having troubles controlling his own chair and maneuvering it to the right path. He did not know how to use his own GPS, and that he was so off course that he was for sure going to land into the ocean a couple of hours after taking off. Now, this is where it starts becoming clear that he was severely underprepared for his flight. And there was another big glaring issue now. So, ideally, whenever somebody attempts a cluster ballooning flight, they usually have a planned method of descent. Now, that could be something as simple as, I think Lawn Chair Larry had taken a pellet gun with him, where he would just shoot a balloon and reduce his altitude. There was another incident where people have used knives to just pull their balloons and pop them. And there were some incidents where people would just untie the balloons and reduce them. Right. Now, it is possible that Father De Carli intended to just open the balloons and let them fly so that he could reduce his flight, which is fair. Now, the actual problem is in the fact that Father De Carli used party balloons. Ideally, you are supposed to use weather balloons. Weather balloons are relatively weather resistant. Party balloons at that kind of altitude, with that kind of temperatures, cannot sustain the pressure inside. Those balloons would not have ideally survived those conditions. A lot of statements were later made about this decision, and there are some worse decisions to come. If you remember, this was supposed to be a world record flight. Father De Carli did not carry an altimeter on his world record flight. There was no official method of recording the height at which his flight went. So, in the end, even the world record attempt was void because this man did not plan to carry a method of recording how high he actually went on his world record attempt. Around 8 hours into his flight, Father De Carli had reported to the port authorities that he had ended up somewhere around 110 miles, about 180 kilometers, south of his starting position on the port of Santa Catarina. He was supposed to go north, east, or northwest. He ends up 110 miles south. Two days later, on April the 22nd, 2008, after 2 days of searching, the local port and fire department was sure that they would find Father De Carli alive and well. He was able to share the GPS location during the last conversation, and that was their major lead during all of this. If you remember, he did not know how to use his GPS. So it was very likely the location that Father De Carli shared was wrong. Even still, the local authorities were sure that had he been stranded somewhere by a beach or an uninhabited island, he still had 5 days worth of food to actually survive that period, and they should be able to find him in that time. Even if Father De Carli had ended up landing in the ocean, the local ocean tides and temperatures were low and calm enough that he would have been able to survive a long duration. And with so many equipment and balloons, they expected to find enough evidence to lead them to his location. All the local authorities and everybody were also looking for Father De Carli, not just towards the ocean, but also towards the inland forests in case he had blown over to a different location. Now, they did not find Father De Carli, but they did find somebody else. They found Marcio Andre Lichten. Lichtown? Lichtown? Lich, Lich, Lichten. Marcio. Who was Marcio? The sheriff? The fire department? Maybe one of the soy billionaires? Marcio was Father De Carli's very own skydiving instructor. Being his own skydiving instructor, the local news really took an interest in what he had to say. This man is a diabolical hater. So, right off the bat, he made sure that everybody knew he had no trust in this man at all. Like, at all. So, there was an incident where during his training sessions, he had complained that um, the father was not a very good student, to put it politely. He would not attend his theory sessions and had only completed about a third of the entire theory session, which would have been around 30 hours. And father was just interested in doing those flights without any of the theories, which would have taught him to plan out all of his flights and the risks, as well as all of the equipment that he would need, and these kind of details. It was during one of these sort of training flights, which was a televised attempt, that Father De Carli refused to listen to Marcio and attempted a jump far too early. This jump, the intention was to go around a hill and to jump at the right moment where they would align to a strip, a landing strip, and they would land directly. Father De Carli attempted the jump on the opposite side of the hill, completely missing the landing strip, and proceeded to get caught in an updraft and lost. He ends up on the opposite side of the hill, stuck in trees, where there was a news crew as well as a fire department that had to rescue him. It was during that rescue where, when he was asked about that incident, Father De Carli outright said that all the instructions that Marcio was providing were only a hindrance in his attempt, and he was not a good teacher. Clearly, they did not have a good relationship at all. This, according to Marcio, was one of the incidents. Another was before his flight. Apparently, Father De Carli had attempted to communicate with Marcio about the details of his flight and get as much of his input about the flight path and days that he was planning to attempt it on. According to Marcio, he had informed Father De Carli that this flight was certain death. He apparently told, and I will explain why I'm saying apparently so much. He apparently told Father De Carli that if he attempted this flight on the 20th of April, he would face a lot of winds blowing southbound. The only place that he could possibly land was the Cape of South Africa. He also had warned him about the incoming rain clouds that he would face during his attempt. It's fairly clear that I don't trust this man at all. 2 days after the fact that Father De Carli has gone missing, his flight instructor was bound to have faced scrutiny. I feel, although they did not have a good relationship at all, that to a certain point, he said a lot of these things to cover his own ass. I felt that his interview and statements were a bit opportunistic. Had this not been the outcome, I think he would have also taken credit for this flight. I also say this because he had also made a lot of statements in the news about his attempt being a danger to Brazilian airspace, and that he would be a very big obstacle and everything. But had he really been involved with the planning and attempt, he would have known that Father De Carli had cleared everything with local authorities. Even the local authorities had given him the permission to attempt this flight in that area at that altitude and to attempt it at that distance. So I think this man is just a pure hater. Just hater. On April the 24th, this is 4 days since the beginning of this attempt. The local authorities have added one helicopter and two boats to their search. Their intention is to cover a 500 square kilometer area as thoroughly as possible so that they are able to actually cover all of the coastal area and towards the ocean, open ocean, so that they are able to make sure that he is not just floating away from the coast. On April the 29th, 9 days since the fateful attack, the local authorities call off the search. After a continuous attack of 135 hours, and with all the help of the local population, the local fishermen, the helicopter, the boats, they are unable to find any evidence of Father Dikali. Now, considering it's 9 days and he only had rations for 5, even if he did not consume them all rapidly, they assume that he probably did not have any more. They assume that he probably would not survive any longer. In June 2008, the lower half of a body is found floating 100 kilometers from an offshore rig by the town of Makai. By the town of
Macaé.
They collect the body and they are able to collect a DNA sample, which is later matched to the DNA of Father Dekali's brother, confirming that this was Father Dekali. The equipment matched to what he was wearing during that flight. They had also found a bunch of those balloons floating by, and yeah, just like that, after 2 months of searching by the local population and 9 to 10 days of rigorous searching by the authorities, the tale of the balloon priest came to an end. I think that by the way this incident unfolds, it does not really leave a lot to the imagination. Father Dekali, even in his preparations, was clearly underprepared for the actual trials of this attempt. And there was also a certain aspect of a kind of pressure as well as his own attempts of that being the hero of the situation. There was a lot of attention and global recognition of his actions, which led him to having that flight so close to his initial attempt. He, I think, wanted to make sure that this left an impact in the minds of people and he was able to garner as much support for his community. And it was here that I feel the outcome also becomes fairly certain. I think Father De Carli survived his initial crash into the water and was actually able to get out from his chair and move. It is there in attempting to swim back towards a shore that I believe he was the victim of a predator, a shark, whatever. And that is why there was no way that people could have ever found an evidence of him. It was his lower half that floated back inland that they were finally able to find what had truly happened to Father Dekali. Now, I Father Dekali did not just receive a lot of praise for his actions. Father Dekali, after this attempt, also received a lot of ridicule. Even the pioneer of cluster ballooning, a man by the name of Jean Picard, the inspiration behind the character from Star Trek, who had attempted his own flights in the early 1900s and gone on to establish multiple societies of cluster ballooning worldwide. And his son, who had gone on to also create the cluster ballooning chapter within the US, would be one of those people who would ridicule Father Dekali for his attempt and his lack of preparations in making sure that he would survive his own flight. I think it was his lack of preparation that truly, in the end, tarnished the legacy of Father Dekali. Because had this not been the end of his tale, he would have had a far more positive legacy to leave behind. even later on receiving awards such as the Darwin Awards of removing himself from the genetic pool of the world, and of all the memes and ridicule. Like, even I came across this story by one of these initial early 2000s meme templates, where it was just a meme about there was a priest who attempted to float away on balloons and ended up dying in the sea. Like, it's very easy to find this story as a completely foolish individual who attempted a flight underprepared and ended up taking his own life. But I think knowing a little more about who Father De Carli was, what motivated his actions, and why he truly wanted to take on such a task presents the entire situation in a more different and a more interesting light. And I hope that even you were as interested in the story as I was. But thank you for listening, and hope to see you again next time.